Hello everyone, welcome back for another chapter of Summer of the Secret Squadron. I have Finley here with me today, and we are going to start reading chapter 18. The next morning didn't come for us until almost 10 o'clock. Mrs. Johnson had let us sleep in. I realized I hadn't asked to spend the night, so I went downstairs to find out if I was in trouble. Mrs. Johnson assured me that she had explained to my mom how we'd fallen asleep listening to CDs. With that relief, I went back upstairs to Sumner and Logan. We only had 2 hours before we made a final decision about getting onto that roof. I mauled them both until they awakened from the dead. We piled down the stairs and ate a breakfast of toaster waffles and bacon and headed out the door. There was no surprisingly cool air at this hour of the day. It was on its way to sweltering. We all went on our bikes. I ran back home and stuck my head inside the kitchen door to let Mom know where we would be, but she was nowhere in sight. I knew I'd see her at lunch, so I went on. The three of us met at the Methodist Church parking lot, and then coasted the 6 blocks down to the paper, the Batesville Daily Times. The newsroom was wide open and hardly any walls. You could see people working all over the room. One guy looked like he was throwing ideas onto a dry erase board. Mrs. Jackson was at a table with 2 other workers when she saw us walk in. She called over to us and left the others at the table. "Well, how'd it go yesterday? Sit down here and tell me everything," Mrs. Jackson insisted. We informed her of yesterday's events, leaving out nothing for her. Mrs. Jones confessed that she had gone to the library yesterday afternoon to fish for clues from Mrs. Payne. Of course, Mrs. Payne had told her everything she knew. Mrs. Jackson was thrilled by all of our finds at Lean-To Cave and at the Bayou Bridge, but she was disappointed that we had not brought our packs so that she could see all of the stuff. Finally, we explained how we had found the badge and the picture of Henry. She was enthralled. She was already envisioning the story in the paper with Henry's picture along with ours. We hadn't even told her the most interesting part. Henry looked like me. I pulled the badge from my pocket and showed it to her. For a moment she was speechless, which was a little unusual for Mrs. Jackson. "For a minute, I thought this was you, Benjamin," Mrs. Jackson said. "That makes it unanimous," I said, somewhat disgustedly. "What was the boy's name?" she asked. "Henry," Logan informed her. "No last name?" she wondered. "Not that we found so far," Sumner voiced. "Well, we should be able to find out who this boy is easy enough," Mrs. Jackson assured her. How? I asked. "First, we need to go up to the courthouse and find who lived in your house in the 40s. What were the years on those comic books?" 1942 and 1943, weren't they?" Sumner asked. He knew the dates as sure as I knew my name. "That should give us a good timeline to begin with. Then we can come back to the paper and look through the archives. If it was a family that just moved to town and bought that house, then there should usually be an announcement in the paper, where the husband was taking a new job, where they had previously lived, those kinds of things." "Can we go right now?" I asked. "Well, let me take care of one piece of business here, and then we'll be off." Mrs. Jackson strode back to the newspaper to one of the desks where a man was busy working on a computer. In a couple minutes she was ready. As we walked up the 3 blocks to the massive stone courthouse, climbed the stairs, and entered the main lobby, I had never been inside here before. It was impressive. 2 mahogany staircases flanked a large matching front desk, along with marble columns throughout the main floor. Mrs. Jackson led us to the desk and asked for the Recorder of Deeds. It sounded like a character out of the Dr. Seuss 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins. "The Recorder of Deeds," I could hear someone say as a trumpet announced his entrance. Of course, that didn't happen. It was upstairs and to the left. We followed Mrs. Jackson up one of the curved staircases to the 2nd floor. We found the large window door that had "Recorder of Deeds" printed in gold, and walked in. Inside there was a funny-looking woman with frizzy red hair typing away on some obsolete typewriter. "Hey, Sandra, I didn't realize you worked up here." Mrs. Jackson probably knew everyone in town. "Hello, Helen. What can I do for you?" asked the Recorder of Deeds, Sandra Lowry. according to the brass nameplate in front of us. This is Benjamin Matthews, and he is wanting to find out who lived in his house back in the 1940s. Ooh, 1940s, huh? She was sounding too optimistic. Well, we'll have to go down to the basement for that one. What's your address? 245 North 7th Street, I answered. 245 North 7th Street, she repeated. Here in Batesville, I assume. Let's look in here for starters. She moved to an old banged-up file cabinet, opened the second drawer, and began mumbling something about Secret Squadron as she flipped through a long row of manila folders. Suddenly, she found what she was looking for and scribbled something down on a piece of paper. All right, I have the location number. We should be able to find the abstract downstairs. Do you want to come with me? Sure, we all said in unison. Oh, yes, I need to know why you need the information, Mrs. Lowry said apologetically. I'm always supposed to ask that, but I feel so nosy. Well, I wasn't actually sure what to say without going into detail. Actually, we found something that probably belongs to a boy who lived in my house back in the 40s. Are you going to return it to him? She looked as if we were crazy. Logan answered, Mainly, we just wondered who he was and if he's still alive. Or if he's around here, Sumner added. Well, now I'm going to be nosy. Mrs. Lowry plopped her elbows down across the front desk with her chin resting on her fists. What did you find? Do you have to know what we found? Sumner asked. No, I said I was just being nosy, she said with a grin, still waiting for an answer. I once again pulled the decoder badge from my pocket. It was mostly kid stuff like this. I handed it to Mrs. Lowry. It's a decoder badge that went along with a radio show. You could send off for them. This and some comic books and a couple cap guns, things like that. It's just that it's a mystery as to why these things were left behind that makes us curious about the boy who lived in Ben's house, Logan explained. Exactly, I said. Well, that's a really neat gadget. She handed the badge back to me. No one commented on mine and Henry's likeness, and neither did she, thank goodness. I've never seen anything like it. It might be worth some money, being antique and all. Well, we're going to look into it, Sumner informed her. Well, if y'all are ready, let's go down to the basement and we'll see what we can find. We followed the recorder of deeds down the mahogany staircase into a nearby door that led us to the much less grand set of concrete steps down into the basement. And now we could see why she needed a location number. The basement was one large room filled with rows and rows of floor-to-ceiling shelves. And every shelf was stacked with books and boxes and papers and folders. No wonder she hadn't sounded optimistic. The place was huge. It reminded me of the warehouse at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, where they stored all the stuff from the Ark of the Covenant. Most of our older files were transferred into microfiche, but as you can see, not all of them yet. Mrs. Lowry nodded, gesturing to the row of shelves. What's microfiche? Logan asked. Mrs. Jackson answered. It's where you take a document and photograph every page. Then all the photos are transferred onto a small index-sized card so that each page is very tiny. It can only be read using a projector that blows them back up to size that's readable. A lot of our old papers are stored on microfiche. It's what everyone used to do 10 years ago or so, but now computers can store everything better. Let's see, the location number is 778.04, so I think it's going to be down this way. Mrs. Lowry pointed to the right. We followed her as she walked through the rows of shelves. The end of each shelf had numbers on it, just like at the library, to make things easier to find. We came to one shelf marked 720 through 850. Should be down here. Mrs. Lowry turned into the very narrow walkway between the two bookcases. We all began to study the boxes that were lining each shelf. Here it is, she said, pulling on a large, heavy box. Why don't we take it over to the table where we'll have more room and light? Boys, why don't you help Mrs. Lowry with that heavy box? Mrs. Jackson suggested. Mrs. Lowry backed further into the cramped space so that Sumner and I could take hold of the box. You weren't lying. This thing weighs a ton, Sumner said as we strained to lift the container. Mrs. Jackson and Logan moved out of the way as we lugged the box slowly back to the front, heaving it onto the table with a sigh of relief. Thank you, boys, Mrs. Lowry said as she pulled off the lid. Inside was crammed with what looked like large notebooks that were bound at the top as opposed to the left side. These are called abstracts, Mrs. Lowry informed. There is one for every plot of land in Independence County. It keeps track of who owns property, the exact size and location, changes to the property, as well as changes in its owners. Is ours in here? I was beginning to get anxious. Here it is. She pulled out a very thick, tattered, leather-bound book. All right, Summer said. Now we're in business. Mrs. Lowry began paging through the old book. We're looking for the owners during the 1940s, right? Right, Logan confirmed. We were all crowded around Mrs. Lowry as she scanned through the abstract for names of previous owners. Everything in the book was so ornately written, at least the first half. Apparently once typewriters became common, everything began becoming boring and plain. Okay, the original owner was Elisha Baxter, who built the house in 1910, owning it until 1932. Mrs. Lowry began to mumble under her breath. From 1932 to 1938, the house was owned by James and Mildred Gerner. Okay, now for what we came for. March of 1938 to May of 1944, the house was owned by Sam and Charlotte Bennett. That gets us into the 40s anyway. From there, it sold to, John Arthur Simmons, who owned it from May 1994 to, not long, December 1944. And that property belonged to Charles Tidwell until, right here, 1956. Do I need to keep going, or were you only needing the owners through the 40s? No, that will do, I think, Mrs. Jackson said, scribbling down the names and dates that Mrs. Lowry had read. We really appreciate all of your help, Sandra. You made this look as simple as pie. I wish I could say it was all this easy, said Mrs. Lowry. She placed the abstract back in the box just the way she found it, and then led Summer and me, along with the box, back down the aisle to the space waiting to be refilled. We all made it back up to the lobby where we thanked Mrs. Lowry again, and she made her way up to the curving staircase. What do you say we grab something to eat over at Jackie's Cafe before we move on with our investigation? My treat. Mrs. Jackson was very generous. Sounds great, but are you sure? We can pack away a lot of food, I warned her. Our story is just the type of human interest piece that sells our newspaper, she winked. I figure I can afford to buy you guys a few hamburgers. We probably need to call our moms, Sumner reminded us. I'll call them as we're walking over, Mrs. Jackson said. I'm sure they won't mind. Of course, they didn't mind at all, and we made our way into the storefront cafe that sat on the upper side across from the courthouse. And that's the end of Chapter 18. Chapter 19. Jackie's Cafe was only open for breakfast and lunch and pretty much served the downtown area only. Most of the people that ate at Jackie's were adults, people that worked at the courthouse or had business or were store owners from downtown. I had only eaten at Jackie's one other time, and it was with Dad and Mr. Parks. For some reason, eating there made me feel very important. Jackie herself came over to take our order as we pretended to look at our menus. We already knew what we wanted. The three of us ordered jumbo cheeseburgers, french fries, and chocolate milkshakes. Are you sure you boys can eat all that? Jackie asked with doubt in her eyes. My cheeseburgers nearly covered the plate. You bet, we all answered one way or the other. Mrs. Jackson ordered the same, except regular size, giving a big smile to Jackie. While we were waiting for our food to come, Mrs. Jackson explained how microfiche worked and what we'd be looking for back at the paper. We will be looking for the names of Sam and Charlotte Bennett, John Arthur Simmons, or Charles Tidwell in an article or announcement. Our food came. The cheeseburgers were huge. Mrs. Jackson called them hubcap burgers because they were as big as one. We dug in, determined to eat everything on our plates, but Jackie had kicked our butts, except Logan. The boy was skinny as a rail but could eat the hind leg of a mule. Logan polished off his cheeseburger, all of his fries, and a few of Sumner's. We finally called it quits, grabbed our shakes, and headed out the door and back down to the Times. Mrs. Jackson led us to the back room that looked a little bit like the basement of the courthouse. There were shelves of boxes everywhere, and every box had a year marked on the outside. Unfortunately, our system of location is not quite as good as the library's, Mrs. Jackson admitted as she scanned the shelves, but we'll find it. At one time, these were all in order, but they haven't been organized in a few years now. How long has the paper been around? Sumner asked, looking at the box labeled 1897. Well, we celebrated our centennial in 1976, the same year as the country's bicentennial. That's 100 years, Sumner said to Logan, who had a dumb look on his face. Here's the 1940s, Mrs. Jackson announced. We all moved over to where she was standing. I think we should start with 1944. The abstract said that John Arthur Simmons owned the house from May of 44 to December of 44. His name should be the easiest to find, or rule out. Mrs. Jackson found the box labeled 1944 and pulled it from among the stack of boxes. It wasn't that big, so she carried it over to the large machine that was in the room. Inside the box were envelopes of microfiche, one for each month. Let's start with May, she suggested, sliding the films in between the two glass plates. The main thing you have to remember is that everything is reversed. If you want to move up, you pull the handle down. If you want to go left, you pull the handle right, like that. It will take some time, but you'll get the hang of it. Now let me show you what we're looking for. She began flying through the pages like an old pro that she was. Here's one. She stopped in an article about David Williams, who was opening a new feed store at the corner of 3rd and Walter Street. Of course, this is a pretty big article because it's a new business. If it was just an announcement of a person being hired by some company, it would be smaller. Let's see if I can find... Here's one, she said, pointing to a smaller article. Now this card is May 1st, and they should be in order. Why don't you start looking through these and see if you can find anything on Mr. John Arthur Simmons? I've got some work to do out front that if you need anything, just come get me. Think you can handle it? Well, I think so, I said. 3 pairs of eyes, hopefully. You will be able to move through them pretty fast. Each of you should choose a different area of the page to scan, Mrs. Jackson advised as she stepped out the door. I'll check on you later. We did as Mrs. Jackson said. Logan took the upper half, I took the lower half, and Sumner did an overall scan of the page to double-check. Logan controlled the reader that moved from page to page. It was slow going at first, but we did get moving faster after a while, stopping occasionally to see some weird pictures of this or that. Mrs. Jackson stuck her head in as we were finishing up the May 12 issue. We were concerned that we might have skipped over something, but she encouraged us to press on. By 2 o'clock we had finished the month of May, albeit our eyes were burning and our heads were spinning from all the pages moving in front of us. We needed a break. I've got to rest my eyes, I said, pressing the palms of my hands over both of them. My back is killing me, Sumner said, standing up and stretching. We need to finish some other business anyway, Logan said, teetering his folding metal chair back and forth on 2 legs. How are we getting up on that lander's roof? We were supposed to decide by noon, Sumner recalled. What will it be, the zip line or the ladder in front of the police station? Logan put it to a vote. I say the ladder, Sumner voted. And I say the zip line. Benjamin, it's up to you to decide, Logan concluded. I don't like either one, I admitted. Well, you're going to have to choose one. You're going to have to do it now, Logan pressed. One's just crazy to me and the other. One is just as crazy to me as the other, so we might as well flip a coin, I said, pulling out a shiny new Mississippi quarter from my pocket. Any objections? I looked at both of them. Guess not, Sumner said. I'll call it. Logan likes his chances with a coin flip. He knew I usually sided with Sumner. Heads, we climbed the marquee. Tails, we used the zip line. I flipped the coin, caught it, and slapped it down on my wrist. Okay, this is it. I raised my hand to reveal magnolia blossoms. Zip line it is. Logan strutted around like he had won the lottery or something. Okay, but you're going to have to prove to us you can shoot an arrow all the way across the Landers Theater to the other side with a string tied to it, Sumner said, doubting. Otherwise, there's no sense in wasting our time with a plan that won't work. We'll do it after we get through at the hardware store today. Downtown should be pretty empty by then. Logan was sure of himself. I felt very unsure about the whole thing, but I did want to get up on that roof as bad as Logan did. I figured that we couldn't get the zip line strung up across the 2 buildings. Then we have to do it some other way anyway. Just then, Mrs. Jackson walked in with 3 drinks in her hands. You boys taking a break? Yeah, we finished all of May without finding anything, Sumner informed her. We're just about to get started on June. Let me look for a little while, she said. That will give your eyes time to rest. If it's not in June or July, we probably aren't going to find the Simmons person. But we may have time to try to find the other names before we have to call it a day. We drank the sodas while Mrs. Jackson loaded the first June issue into the reader and began scanning for John Simmons. She could do a whole newspaper in about 30 seconds. She made us look slower than black molasses on a cold day. She had knocked off the first 2 weeks before we even finished our sodas. Watching Mrs. Jackson work the machine was almost hypnotic. It put me into such a relaxed state that I almost fell asleep. But just as I was about to doze off, something caught Mrs. Jackson's eye. I think I found what we're looking for, she sung out. Of course, we were all crowded around the screen. Mrs. Jackson read the article aloud. Arkansas Limestone Company announces the addition of John Arthur Simmons as plant manager in charge of operations. Mr. Simmons joins Arkansas Limestone as the company expands operations in Bethesda and Cushman. Simmons is relocating from Dardanelle and will make his home in Batesville, along with his wife, Mary Ellen, and son, Henry. Henry Simmons! We all said his name. We celebrated for a few minutes until we realized that we still had no clue who the boy was or what had happened to him, but at least we now knew his name. Now what do we do? I asked, looking at Mrs. Jackson. Well, first thing I would do is look in the telephone book. You never know. He might still live right here in Batesville, she advised. Surely not, Sumner said, shaking his head. Probably not, but often people overlook something that's sitting right under their noses, Mrs. Jackson said, flipping the tip of Sumner's hat. We wouldn't want to do that now, would we? Mrs. Jackson stepped out of the room for a moment and then came back with a 4-area phone book. We all took one and began looking up the name Henry Simmons. Everyone grab a pencil and paper and write down every Simmons name and phone number in your book, Mrs. Jackson instructed. If we don't find a Henry Simmons, we can still call the other Simmons names and see if they might know a Henry Simmons. But there were no Henry Simmonses in any of the phone books. But we compiled a list of 7 Simmonses after eliminating duplicates. When should we call them? Sumner asked. Well, why not right now? Mrs. Jackson suggested. We might be able to catch some of them at home during the day. We walked out to one of the vacant desks in the newsroom and began dialing numbers. The first 2 weren't home, but we caught the 3rd person in. Unfortunately, the lady did not know anyone by the name of Henry Simmons, and it was the same for the other 2 people we found at home. None had ever heard of a Henry Simmons. What do we do now? We kept turning to Mrs. Jackson for advice. I think we still have a couple of things we can do from here, she said, holding up one finger on each hand. I think our next step is to make a visit to the Arkansas Limestone Company to see if they have any old records on Mr. Simmons. Do you still have some time? I guess so, I said. Where's Arkansas Limestone? It's only a few minutes outside of town, Mrs. Jackson assured. Well, let's go, Logan charged. That's the end of Chapter 19. Interesting. Henry Simmons. We'll see what they find out.